2nd, 1996. An interview with survivor Albert Neuwirth, interviewed by Juliet Halpern in New York in the United States, done in English. I am Juliet Halpern, H-A-L-P-E-R-N, interviewing survivor Albert Neuwirth, December 2nd, 1996, in New York. Go ahead.
I am Albert Neuwirth, N-E-U-W-I-R-T. I was born October 10, 1924, in Neuwirth, N-O-W-Y-T-A-R-G, Poland.
What is that near?
Near Krakow.
So that makes you how old today?
72.
Tell a little about your family, size of your family.
Okay. I was born there in that small town, and my family consisted of my father, my mother, myself, my younger brother, and a younger sister. And my father was a baker. He married my mother. My mother was native to that town, and her family was the bakery business primarily. My grandfather and my uncle and my granduncle all had bakeries. My father was a baker, and he worked for my grandfather. And when I started going to school, it was my first encounter with the surrounding world, so to say, because outside of the Jewish community, it wasn't very pleasant, because of course anti-Semitism in Poland was very widespread, and I encountered all kinds of epithets like Jew, Christ killer, dirty Jew, heretic, and so on and so forth. And but somehow we got along just the same. And I was enrolled in a cheder when I was barely 5 years old.
I'd like to ask, how large was the Jewish community?
Oh yes, the Jewish community was about 2,500 people. The town itself had about 10,000 population, out of which 25% was Jewish. The town was small, as towns go, but it wasn't that typical stagnant village. It wasn't Anatevka, let's put it this way. It was a very vibrant Jewish community. I remember all kinds of events, like Jewish plays being put on by amateur theater group. There was a library. I remember sports club like Maccabi, the Hagibor. I remember Zionist organizations like Akiva, Shomer Atzair, Beta, the Mizrahi. I remember the Polet Zion and all kinds. There was a lot of things going on all the time. There was lectures, and there was all kinds of performances. It was a vibrant community. It was enriched by the fact that it was like a resort town, where for the summer people used to come from big cities. People used to come to spend the summer, and they were naturally a little more sophisticated, so they brought new ideas and all that. The town was pretty much alive. And of course there was the religious group.
How did your family live? Did you have a house?
No, we lived in an apartment. Of course, we didn't live very well, because my father was just working and earning a salary. My mother used to supplement the income by baking cakes. She was a pretty good baker. And somehow we scraped along, but there wasn't any overabundance of things. And plus the fact that at the time, the amenities that we enjoy today weren't there. Electricity was there, but only very expensive, so there was very limited use for it, because it was mostly for light. But I even remember times when we used to have petroleum lamps. Water, there was no running water, so we had to go to wells. There were wells all over town. There was no sewers to speak of. And so it was not even the rich people didn't look all that well, but because telephones and things like that, very few people had. But, you know, you settled down in a groove and the life was going on, and so most everybody was happy.
Were your playmates mostly from the Jewish community?
Mostly from the Jewish community, because I didn't have no playmates of Gentiles and Jews didn't mix all that much, not socially anyway. And of course, like I said, Poland, before the war, was a pretty anti-Semitic country because church had a lot of influence. So I understand the desire here to keep church and state apart, because I saw firsthand what the interference of church in state affairs brings about. So we've been as happy as could be. I went to school, and I had a very rigorous schedule because I had to go to the Cheder too. So school was from 8 to about 1 o'clock, and from there stay to the Cheder from 1 to about 6. And that was 5 days a week. On Sunday it was a whole day in the Cheder because public school was not working. And on Saturday we used to go, of course, to services, and after services there was always a little something to do in the Cheder too. So it wasn't like there was much time for fooling around and for having a lot of fun. But looking back at it, I mean, in those days, I looked at it with the eyes of a child. Looking back at it, I can appreciate more what there was that I didn't appreciate then. Because there was a religious community, there were a lot of Orthodox Jews too, and they all had their rabbis, and they all had their celebrations and different kinds of things. Some of my Jewish friends used to go, their parents used to take them regularly. They used to take the trips to these wonder rabbis that there used to be big rabbis like, not the Lubavitcher we didn't have in Poland. They come from Russia. The Satmars, which is the other extreme, come from Hungary. But they had one sect that's still there in Borough Park is the Bobover, and that was from Poland. So they all had their affiliations, they all had their way of life, and it was nice the way everything worked together. And I just, looking back at it, and I really try not to look through rose-colored glasses at this whole thing, but looking back at it, it was a pretty good life there for everybody. And so,
describe a way a holiday would be celebrated, for example.
Holidays, of course, prayers, and then after that, not that much different than here. You come home from shul and have a big meal, and then certain occasions like Simchat Torah, for instance, would be a lot of dancing in the synagogue and a lot of joy. In the before the high holidays, for instance, there's this prayer in the morning which is called Slichot. And the Slichot is very early in the morning. So the beadle from the synagogue used to come around to the Jewish homes and tap the windows and call out to the people to get up and pray. So, you know, it was a pretty, as far as that's concerned, my parents were not what you call Orthodox. They weren't Orthodox, but they were religious. There was very few irreligious people in that town. But the religious people were wearing those black kaftans and those beards and side curls, whereas my father was clean-shaven. He wore Western clothes, but he was religious just the same. And so things went along. I went to school through 7 years of public school education. I enjoyed school. I enjoyed reading very much. I read a newspaper every day. That's why pretty much on all the news of those days, because they were very disturbing times, especially after 1933 when Hitler came to power. And we, everything, people started worrying, especially the Jews, because,
How did that affect you?
well, not right away, but, you know, you saw the handwriting on the wall. He, of course, raved and ranted about the Jews continuously, and as he annexed Austria, and then Czechoslovakia was sold down the river, and he got Czechoslovakia. He surrounded Poland already on 2 sides, and on 3 sides actually, because in the north of Poland, East Prussia, all Poland had is a corridor to the Baltic Sea by Danzig, the Danzig corridor. And this he used as a pretext to attack Poland, but we knew already that Poland was going to be next. So
what was going on in your family and among your friends?
nothing. Some people tried to get out if they could. Very few could, because there were
Do you
quotas.
remember talk at home
Oh,
about
yes.
how
There
to
was a-
leave?
Yes, there was talk how to leave, but that's all it was, is talk. It would take someone to take you, to allow you in, and as that letter that I have from the American consular official from the embassy in Warsaw, where my uncle Abe White, who was here, tried to bring my father out of Poland, and the man actually writes that he couldn't do anything because the quota is exhausted for the next 2-3 years. Polish government doesn't issue visas, especially not to men of military age, which my father was. And the whole thing, he says, the war was inevitable. He writes in a letter. This letter, it was dated August 22nd, which was like 8 days before the outbreak of war. So there were efforts being made, but they were not successful in most cases. I don't remember too many people that managed to leave. Who left mostly is people that went to Palestine, what was then Palestine. So I remember a lot of young people trained on farms, and that they called the Hakshara. They learned how to farm, how to work the land, and then they used to go to Palestine. Those are the ones that escaped, basically. So as time goes on, as 1939 was approaching, 1938 was already getting pretty bad. Germans sent in a lot of agents into Poland, and of course they used the Jews as scapegoats. So started boycotting Jewish businesses, and Jewish business people suffered a lot because they intimidated the Polish people from buying from Jews. This was done to distract the population from other problems which were coming their way, and of course the Poles, by and large, you would think that facing a common enemy they would already stop this, but no, instead this whole thing increased. It was a frenzy like. And my father had just acquired a bakery about 1938. Finally, after working all these years, he saved enough money to buy a bakery. And this thing really hurt him to the point where he had to lay off his only employee, and I had to go to work. At the age of 14, I worked in a bakery, worked nights, and it was...
You had to leave school?
No, I only, well, the 7 years public education I got because that was compulsory. There were plans for me to go on to business school, but of course never came out, nothing came out of it. There wasn't any money, and I was needed at home. So this thing went along like that in 1939 and 1939. The screams from Berlin got louder and louder. He was clamoring for that corridor, and he was looking for a pretext to attack Poland. And we knew the Jewish community was well aware that sooner or later he's going to come into Poland. It was like you had a sword suspended over your head, and you were wondering when the blow will finally fall, because it was inevitable.
Before we go into those years, you were 14 at that point, and your brother was how old?
12.
And your sister?
My sister actually passed away at the age of 8. She may have probably died around 1934, 35, I would say.
What did she die?
Well, those days they couldn't diagnose almost everything. There was some kind of a respiratory disease, which from the description here today I could say it must have been like cystic fibrosis or something, up to that effect. So my sister was dead at the time, and my brother was younger. He was still in school.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
Her death?
Yes, I remember. It was a real traumatic experience. My parents went through, and myself, and my brother, and I remember that very well. But this was nothing unusual in those days too, because children used to die. A lot of children died at an early age. I had a playmate across the street, a girl that also died at the age of 8. And this was happening a lot. Because the state of medicine in those days wasn't what it is today. I remember some of my friends winding up in a hospital for appendicitis. They spent 4 weeks in the hospital, flat on their backs. And this was the state of medicine. That's all they knew in those days. So, of course, mortality was pretty high among young, the very young, and the older.
What were your dreams for your future life when you were young?
Well, I was going to be a bookkeeper, an accountant. I also would like to play the violin. And of course there were dreams, unattainable, especially not when the war came. I used to be very well aware of things. I used to read a lot. I used to read the newspaper every day. And I used to discuss politics with my elders. But as for the realizing any particular dream, well, I was only 15 when the war started.
So what happened?
Well, on September 1st, 1939, the blow fell. I just finished a night shift with my father in the bakery. We were washing up, and we heard a roar of airplane engines and shots being fired outside. Of course, a few days prior to that, the atmosphere was very tense. Everybody knew that it's about to happen. There was a lot of troops in the area too, because there was border area with Czechoslovakia. They were firing at German spotter planes that were just flying over, looking things over. They were firing rifles and pistols. That's about all they had. And of course, from there on, it was all like a succession of things. The town was evacuated on orders of the army. Of course, most of us hit the road, same day. Some people stayed behind. With a few clothes on our backs and some money, whatever was available, and that's about all. We started walking on foot down the road, and the Polish authorities told us that it's only a matter of moving a little further away from the border, and that the Germans will be stopped by the Polish army. Of course, never happened that way. So we were walking and walking and walking day and night. We slept nights in the fields, and we were walking on foot, and there were thousands of people jamming the roads, and the army was in between. It was chaos, utter chaos. In between, the German planes were coming down and strafing the roads, killing people right and left. We escaped. We had a few close calls there on those roads too. And
you seem to recall that very vividly.
yes, it was all these things, those are events that you don't forget. no matter what. You can put them in the back of your mind, but you can recall them very readily. So we walked that way for about a week or so. We were, of course, exhausted. Food was impossible to get. We were hungry and cold. Our shoes disintegrated, and in here still the artillery was firing behind us, the planes were flying and bombing and strafing, and there was no sign of the Polish army being able to stop anybody. And the direction we took, my father was born in a part of Poland near Przemysl, P-R-Z-E-M-Y-S-L. It's a fairly large city and on the what was then southeast of Poland. So, yes, it was pretty much southeast. And he was born in a small town there, and he was apprenticed to someone where he learned his trade as a baker. We came to that village where his former boss lived, and they still lived there, him and his wife and his children. And the lady, who was a very wise lady, told my father, he says, look, where are you running? Oh, it's obvious that Poland is lost. There'll be no rolling back the Germans. Stay here, let them pass you by, and go back home, which we did. My father accepted our advice. We stayed there, and for about a couple of days was very quiet, nothing happening. Then the German army started rolling by. It was awesome, this whole display of military hardware, this machinery and all that. We never seen anything like that. And there was always plunder, and always right away they came in, these people had a store, and they started plundering and at gunpoint. Every time a new group came in, lined us up against the wall with raised hands, and they started ransacking the house. And there's no use telling them that there was already so many people before them, there was nothing left in that house. But they didn't care. So we stayed there.
How long had you been on the road?
We were on the road, give or take, about 7 or 8 days. And we arrived at that point, and we spent about 2-3 days there, and we went back as soon as the German army went forward. What they left behind is these troops that occupied, and we had to get a permit, and we went back, walking back again. There's no trains running or anything like that. So we were walking and walking. We came back to our town, and it was just Yom Kippur Eve. By that time, our house was ransacked, the bakery was ransacked, everything was stolen. The synagogue was already occupied by the German troops. They made a stable out of it. They stabled horses in it. And small groups of people were gathering for services in private homes. And of course, from there on, things started rolling along. To begin with, they took hostages. They took hostages, mostly professional people and mostly prominent citizens, Jews as well as Poles. And those people we never saw again. You know, the policy was to nip potential leadership in the bud, so there's no resistance being organized. And of course, all these every day.
Were you understanding that at the time it was happening?
Sure. Every day, practically, there were new laws, new decrees posted. And of course, the usual thing, first they giving up all the firearms, naturally. All radio equipment had to be surrendered. Jews couldn't own any businesses, and it's all under the penalty of death. They started really enforcing the draconian laws. Then came the law about the Star of David. We had to wear an armband with the Star of David on our arm. Jews couldn't walk on the sidewalk. Whenever you encountered a German soldier, you had to take off your hat and bow to them. Such things, started with such, when they caught a Jew with a beard, they used to shave him. And humiliation, they inflicted humiliation, and they took Jews to work in the marketplace after a market. Usually was a lot of horsemen, they loved to have the Jews clean that up, and so on. And little by little, things were getting worse and worse. It was like...
Did you experience something that was
Oh,
degrading,
yes.
as you said?
Oh, yes. There was, I walked the street many times. They would just grab me from the street and make me do some work. And they used to, any kind of work they needed, they used to take Jews straight from the street as you walked. You never knew where they're going to take you and why they're going to take you, what they're going to do to you. They just grab you from the street. So this was 1939, the first few months of war, and it's like, but people think that maybe it was the SS that committed these atrocities. It was also mostly the German Wehrmacht, the army. They weren't any better. Some of them were, but most of them were already Nazis. And so, the end of 1939, of course, in the spring of 1940, the Gestapo moved in and the SS after the occupation troops left. And they were fewer, but they were much more brutal and much more cruel. And they tried to instill fear in people, which they succeeded very well, because every act of resistance, no matter how trivial, was met with brutal force. They were killing people, shooting people for no good reason at all. Any kind of act of sabotage, like there was an act of sabotage being committed somewhere near Krakow. So Krakow and Płaszów. Płaszów was a suburb of Krakow. There was two separate railroad stations about, I would say, no more than 5-6 kilometers apart. They caught a man, these were Poles now I'm talking, and hung up a man on every telegraph pole along the railroad, just as a retribution for some act of sabotage. And then again...
Let's pause for a moment now. This is tape 2 of an interview with survivor Albert Neuwirth, December 2nd, 1996.
Okay, so now we are until 1940. My father, who of course was out of business, couldn't find any work but something sporadic from once in a while, because Polish people took over the Jewish businesses. So since he knew them from before the war, they used to give him a job once in a while. My mother was home. She wasn't feeling well. She was sick. My sister, of course, was dead that time, but my brother was still there. I and my brother, when they settled down this whole thing, they formed what they call Judenrat. Now, Judenrat consisted of like a few prominent citizens, Jewish citizens, who were supposed to be the go-between the authorities and between the Jewish community. Mostly they were used to collect fines and plunder and all this. Of course, this wasn't voluntary, and I know that these people suffered because they had to do this. So they set up a system whereby instead of catching people in the street, they would come to the Jewish Judenrat and request so many people for so many Jews. They would call in during the day any time. We need 12 Jews or 20 Jews or 5 Jews. And while this was still in Jewish hands, some people who had money didn't want to go to these jobs, so they would pay a certain amount of money to have a substitute picked for them. And I was one of those substitutes. I worked there so in other words, anytime they needed someone to go to work someplace, they would send to me for me, and I would go and get paid for this. Because once a week I had to work for myself, to my share of labor. But then this way I did a lot of different kinds of work in different places and with different people. And so at that time I worked on we were converting a building to the Germans Officers Club, and there was a lot of all kinds of craftsmen working, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers. I worked with all of them. That's how I learned a lot of things. I was just a young boy, and it was not so bad already, because you didn't have to deal with the Germans. These were Polish people. And
so you would work during the day and go home at night?
Yes, this was still...
And what did you mean that once a week you had to work
Well, once a week, because I was, if they had to be evenly divided, everybody had to put in their share of work. Now, I was getting paid for 4 times, but once a week, like, this was my share. I had to give them a day. But this was still, I'm talking about home. We are still home. Such home as home was.
You mean everybody who worked would contribute to the home?
Yeah, no.
Is that what you're talking about?
No, everybody who would work would have to work like once a week, right? Every citizen, every Jewish citizen had to, but it boiled down to 1 day a week. And if I wanted to work 5 days a week, I would get paid for 4, but that 1 day a week I had to work for free. This was my contribution to the system. But they developed that kind of a system and worked fine because I needed the money, and these other people didn't want to go and do the dirty work which was required of us. And it worked for after a while, so such as once in a while they started something and they would shoot a few people for here and there for whatever reason. Just, this was this reign of terror which they kept on to keep the population on the foot. Then this job finished one day.
Your brother also go there?
No, my brother was still young for that. Eventually, later on, he used to do that too. One day I was walking down the street when I heard a whistle behind me, and I turned around. There was SS captain, excuse me, SS captain who was chasing me. He was running after me and says, "Stop!" And as I stopped, he says, "Come with me." And I came around the corner. They had a truck, and he says, "On the truck." There was already a few people on the truck, and then here we're going to get some more. And we didn't know what was going on. What they're going to do with us. You know, the possibility of being taken out someplace and shot was very, very real. And we worked for a while. Well, this captain was, his name was Kruger. His uncle was the general in charge of police of the Polish occupied territories. He himself ran a school in Zakopane, which was a resort town. When you spell Zakopane? All right. It was a Polish resort town about 15 kilometers from Neuwirth in the Tatra Mountains. They have taken over a hotel there, and they set up a school. They taught their allies, the Slovaks, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians. They were training them for guard duty in the concentration camps. And he was running this thing along with 2 other officers. They were running this thing, and he decided that we needed some work done, whatever that work was. So he went, grabbed 25 of us, put us on a truck, and we went. But of course, until you find out where you go. So we spent a week there, was working like all kinds of nuisance work, like with nothing specific that needed to be done, just to harass you. And so he then, come the weekend, they were drunk, they had those binges, so they came out and they were beating anybody who they get a hold of, and you know, carrying on all kinds of things. So as I was passing by the yard, he spotted me, and he was drunk as a lord and swaying on his feet, and he called me over, and he took out a cigar and gave me a cigar, and he wanted me to smoke the cigar. So I started smoking, and he told me to puff because he wanted me to get sick from it. But it didn't work that way. So he took the matches and he touched matches to the tip, and it made me pull the sulfur and all that, and I didn't affect me much one way or the other. And finally he turned around and he was looking at something else. I just took a dive behind the bushes, and he never missed me. But that was my experience with cigars. Matter of fact, became a lifelong habit. I liked cigars since then on. But we were there for about a week, and after that, suddenly as they got us, suddenly they brought us back. They grabbed another 25 people, brought them for the same. It was like for amusement mostly.
So did your family know where you had gone?
Eventually they knew, but the first couple of days they did not. They were very worried. And
how long were you there?
It's just 2 weeks. 2 weeks they brought us back. So I went back to the same normal routine until summer. The summer of 1940, the town had to supply a contingent of people to send to Rožnov. Rožnov was a town near Nowy Sącz. Nowy
How do you
Sącz.
spell?
Nowyszach. This outside of Nowy Sącz was this village of Rožnov, and Polish government started building a hydroelectric dam. And that dam was partly finished only, and the Germans decided they want to finish that. Of course, they finished it with Jewish labor because that was the cheapest labor they could get. So they sent us over there for my town. Of course, I was picked among others, and we went to, this was my first labor camp. We went to that camp, and we slept in those, some kind of...
That camp was called?
That was Rožnov. Rožnov. And we worked on the side. There was like a valley that was supposed to be flooded, and all the roads that were in the valley had to be cut into the side of the mountains high up above the flood level. And so this was our job, building roads, and of course most of the work was done manually. They used very few machines because Jewish labor was plentiful. So I spent there the summer working like that. Nothing much happened there. It wasn't camp like the camps. It was just a labor camp. There was just a couple of sheds out in the field, and surrounded by a fence with a few guards. Ukrainians guarded it. And we used to go every day to work. We used to come back, and nothing much happened there, really.
This was still Poland?
That's Poland, yes. We spent the...
And what conditions? What food? What?
Well, food...
How did you sleep?
We all slept at triple-tiered bunks, and these were like buildings, like temporary buildings, like sheds. Must have been something there, some kind of a plant. And so When the summer went by and it was starting to get a little cool, I decided that enough of that, and to get together with another fellow, and we hit the road. We got this weekend pass. For they were still issuing weekend passes because most of the people that came were from just the surrounding towns and villages. They could reach their homes within an hour or two and be back within 24 hours. It was just like an army. But for me, the trip was much longer than that, and we couldn't possibly get on a train, had to walk it. So I and the other fellow were walking for 3 days. We walked, and it was getting real cold and nasty. It was already getting fall. And on the third day, we were very close to the town, to Neuwirth, when we somewhere got sidetracked, and it was very foggy, and we strayed near the border. The Czechoslovak border was nearby, and next thing you know, we hear dogs barking, and the Germans running, and stop, and right away raise your arms, and where you going, who are you, what you doing here? It's all interrogation. So they started searching us. My friend, who was a religious man, had a pair of phylacteries in his rucksack. So they got a good kick out of that. They wanted to know what it was and what it's being used for, and they made him put it on and all stuff. But basically, it was a pretty good-natured encounter yet, so they wanted to know where we go. And we told them that we have a weekend pass, but we couldn't get on any train, and so we had to walk. But that pass was expired by then already, so they told us to go back to town and immediately report to work, because otherwise we'll be arrested. So that we got away cheap. We came to town. By that time we were already pretty filthy and lice infested. When I came walking, the first man I encountered was the landlord of the building where we lived, and he didn't even let me into the house. He said, he took me in the yard, took off my clothing, he burned it, helped me clean up, wash up, get disinfected, and that's why I went in the house. And that was the first encounter with a camp, but that was a far cry from the camps I was later on. You know, these things were getting progressively worse. But with this, as soon as I came settled down, I registered for work, and I got work with a company, German company, that was rebuilding the roads around the area. So we used to be picked up in the marketplace every morning. It's taken out on the work site and worked through the day.
So you were back in home?
Right. They used to bring us back home. It was still home. All along we were home. And this lasted for a few months. And then it was going by priorities. The company that got us next was a company by the name of Hobag, H-O-B-A-G. Hobag was a German company which produced prefabricated housing and prefabricated barracks for army and prefabricated hangars for airplanes, all made of wood. So being that the area was plentiful in lumber because in the mountains, they had brought the lumber, they had developed 3 plants there, 3 separate sawmills. One was in Neuwirth, one was in Zakopane, and one was in Čarni Dunajec. So the one I was assigned to was Čarni Dunajec, which was again about 15 kilometers from my hometown, which we had to commute by train there every day. So we started by commuting in regular trains, then they put us in the baggage cars. Eventually we wind up with on open box cars, rain or shine, winter or summer. We were going there every day to work. We spent the day there, long day, and we came back home. Sometimes there was a station master, a Nazi, who would grab us, it made us perform some work around the station yet for another hour or two. So it was a tough deal, and we worked over there till about, I started working for Hobart in 1941 around, say, October. And I worked there through the summer of 1942, at which time things started happening again. First of all, they took all the Jews from the surrounding villages, because they're small villages, a lot of Jews were there, farmers and tavern keepers and all that, and they started bringing them to Neuwirth. So the rumors started spreading that they're going to set up a ghetto. So Polish people and Jews negotiated a swap in houses. They more or less, somebody said that the ghetto will be in this particular area. Polish people that had houses there would swap houses with the Jews who had houses in the other area, so that they could then move in. And they said after the war they figured if that comes to pass, they will exchange them again. Well, ghetto never happened, but what was happening is they were preparing for expulsion of the Jewish population completely from that town. And these rumors were flying, and nobody really knew what was going to happen, but it's stepped up, this arrests were stepped up, killings were stepped up, and one day I came home from work, and the door on the house was sealed by the Germans, and we found out that after inquiring of the neighbors that they came in during the day and they took everybody out of that house. There was a family living by the landlord, his wife, his 3 children, and there were a couple of other people, and they picked them up. They picked up a lot of other people, and they picked up the rabbi, they picked up the 2 slaughterers, and all in all about 60 people. They took them out of the cemetery and shot them and buried them in a common grave. So this was like a prelude. Also at that time my mother died. My mother fortunately was dead by the time this happened. She died like a couple months before that, and we were thanking God that she was dead, because otherwise she would have been taken out with the other people. But anybody who was in the house during the day was taken.
What had she died of?
I really don't know. She was very sick. There was no doctors anymore. There was nothing. She went to the hospital in the evening, and next morning they told us that she was dead. So it's one of those things. She wasn't a well person all along, and things are only getting worse because, under those conditions. So we were thankful that she was dead, and also to relate another episode, well, after my mother died, we have prayers in the apartment, and for me and my brother to say the Kaddish for the dead, and we had a Torah scroll. After they sealed this house, the Torah was in there still, and my father was very upset about it because he didn't want to leave it there to be desecrated by the next tenants or whoever else was taken. So he decided that we have to get it out of there, and the only way to get it out, it was at night. Trouble is, there was a curfew there, and after 10 o'clock, they shot first and asked questions later. So I and my brother, my father, used to have to go through the backyards and jump over fences to get to the back door of the house, open the house, and we took the Torah out of there. Because at that time, my landlord had a father-in-law who was paralyzed. He had a stroke. And they took the man out in the yard and shot him there. There was still a puddle of blood we had to jump over where the man was shot, because anybody who couldn't move or something like that, they didn't make any. So this was the state of affairs. this evacuation from the house was already made us pretty much homeless.
What about the extended family?
Well,
Aunts, uncles?
a lot of them, some of my family wound up in Russia because the dividing line was the River San, S-A-N. The River San divides Poland, pre-war Poland, practically in half almost. So when the Germans made a pact with the Russians, they both invaded at the same time. And the River San was their dividing line. So the Germans went out to the River San, the Russians came up to the River San from the east, and this was the border. So a lot of people who went close, either there close or even afterwards, it was possible to travel to the River San and go across, either swimming or by boat or something. The Russians at first didn't make any issue of it, other Germans for that matter, but eventually they tightened up. The people started getting shot at from both sides. But some of my family wound up in Russia. And specifically my great uncle, his wife, and his 4 children.
Your mother's family?
My mother's family. And one of my uncles, Herman Indig, was a very hot-tempered man and tough. And while he was performing some work there, a German soldier hit him with a rifle butt, and he wrestled the rifle away from him and hit him with it. And of course they arrested him and they took him to the cemetery, shot him. That was a small act of resistance. Everything was punishable by death. He was a very brave man. His family, of course, was all there. One of my uncles, Sam Wildstein, was a communist. So some short time before the war, he was ordered someplace else on the other end of Poland. And his wife followed him there, and his 2 children too. So we didn't hear from them anymore. And so the family scattered. The people in my father's town, we didn't know what was going on. In the beginning it was possible to get mail yet, but eventually we lost track of that. And in 41, when the Russians attacked, when the Germans attacked Russia, they sent in the Einsatzgruppen, which systematically killed off Jews there. So of course my grandfather and my father's family, who were in that part of Poland, must have all died at that point, because suddenly we stopped getting mail. Our mail wasn't getting through. There was no answer. So this was 1941. Of course, I worked still at Hobach, and at one day I worked with a group of people outside, just outside the office, and it started pouring rain, and we hid on the roof to stay dry, and suddenly one of the officers who was in charge of that factory really had no SS guards, only like camp security. These were uniformed people. There were all kinds of assorted bunch of misfits that weren't fit for the front. And this guy calls me over and he says, "Why aren't you working?" I said, "It's raining outside, but it's raining very hard, and we want to wait out a few minutes." So he took a stick and hit me over the face a couple of times, and he says, "You mean to tell me you're not working because it's raining?" He says, "Go tell Roosevelt that you can't work because it's raining." I didn't know why he said that, but then I found out that that was the day that the United States declared war on Germany, and they were so incensed. So he says, "Tell Roosevelt that you can work." We couldn't figure out where Roosevelt came into this. Anyway, this was the summer, and as I said, the rumors were flying, and all kinds of things were happening, and nobody knew what was coming, but everybody knew something was coming.
So at this point, you're what age?
1942 was 18. 18. So,
Doesn't sound like you had time for the usual occupation
no.
of an 18-year-old.
No, I never had any childhood, not before the war, not, of course not during the war. But here they started building, they built some kind of a barrack in the back of that plant, and they started hinting that it was for us. But we didn't realize what they were hinting at until September, I don't remember the exact date, for some reason or another, whether consciously or subconsciously, the exact day I don't remember. I know it was September. It must have been 1st or 2nd of September 1942, when suddenly the town was filled up with these German SS and the Ukrainian guards and the Lithuanians, every assortment of everything, and they sent out messengers to all the Jews that all the Jews have to assemble at the soccer stadium, which was located conveniently across the street from the railroad station. And of course, they started beating people and hitting people and chasing people and like animals. Like my father was at work at night in the bakery, one of the bakeries. He wasn't even home. So I went out, tried to look for him, and everywhere he went, they were just not only wouldn't let you go, but they used to kick you, beat you back to the stadium, Finally, I spotted my father, fortunately, and my brother and my father went in. We put on some extra clothing and everything else, because by now it was obvious what was happening. And we went, and there was like, you know, not like the scene that you've seen in that movie, Fiddler on the Roof, when they had to leave Anna Tefka, except this was much more confused yet, and everybody, people were sick, so the sick people, they were putting on these little wheelbarrows and taking them there, waste of effort, because sick people, they wouldn't even bother putting on boxcars. Anyway, here we go, and this, it's a hot day, and we come to the stadium, there's already people assembled, there's a crazy situation, they are beating people, they are pushing people around and yelling at people. I and my brother, this is the hard part. They didn't let us even part from our father in a decent way. They just chased us, ripped us apart.
Let's pause for a moment and we'll continue. This is tape 3 of an interview with Albert Neuwirth on December 2nd, 1996.
Yeah, so we
You
came
were starting to talk about a hard part.
Right. This was a heart-wrenching, because we couldn't even part from our father in a decent way. They just wouldn't let you. It's how could you, this brutality, this complete disregard for everything. They either pulled him away on one side, where the majority of the population were Jewish population. They took me and my brother on the other side, where they got about 300 people, young people, mostly between